Hello, today we're going to be talking about relationship management, and I know this is a little bit vain, but this is one of the ugliest PowerPoints that I have ever made, and I don't know what I was thinking, and I need to redo it, so I just apologize for how visually offensive this PowerPoint is going to be. Orange, orange, what was I thinking? All right. So, during your business degree, you've probably heard the word businesses called organizations a lot, right? And you may not have stopped to wonder, what are they organizing? What a business is an organization of what? Businesses are organizations of human activity, of people, of behavior. Um, and it's people coordinating their effort to accomplish a greater goal than they could individually, right? That's what an organization is. And often when we think of organizations and the structure of organizations, we see them like this, where there's like a leader at the top and then this very clear power hierarchy. And that exists. That is the structure of formal authority within an organization. But another way to look at this, at the power structure of organizations, is like this. And there are all these informal social relationships that exist within organizations, right? You go to church with that person, you play golf with that person, that's your aunt's best friend from high school. And you have these social relationships with people, and oftentimes that's how things really get done in organizations, right? You are able to get the resources you need because you worked with that supervisor on a project and you guys worked really well together. And so she's hooking you up now. Or whatever it is, you've developed relationships with people. And so relationship management, being able to work effectively with people across the organization, is one of the most valuable skills you can have as a leader, as a coworker, just at all levels of an organization, to tap into this informal set of relationships, which is often more influential than the formal structure. We're going to talk about social awareness and relationship management today. Specifically, we're going to talk about the importance of coordinating moods. We'll talk about how to help other people regulate their emotions using the same recognize, relax, distract, problem solve method that we talked about in regard to self-regulation. We'll talk about the importance of establishing boundaries with people. And then we'll talk about the importance of developing social skills in others. First, we'll talk about the importance of coordinating moods. We like to think of ourselves as like individual beings with our own will and like controllers of our own destiny. And we are, to a large extent we are. But humans are also fundamentally social animals. And so much of our lives and the way we think about our lives and the way we think about ourselves is influenced by the people that we interact with, and especially the emotions of the people that we interact with. Emotions ripple through a crowd, which you know if you've ever been to a concert or a football game, that emotions are contagious, they're shared to some extent. And what's kind of ironic is that even when intellectually we disagree with people, we're usually sharing a common emotional frame of reference. And what do I mean by that? What's an emotional frame of reference? It's the emotional relationship that we have towards the situation. So, for example, even when a conservative and liberal, when they're vehemently arguing against one another, they disagree with each other very much on the intellectual content of what they're saying. And yet emotionally, they have the exact same frame of reference, right? It's anger, it's fear, it's all these different things. The emotional frame, and that's the emotional frame, is how do the people in the situation feel about the situation? And even when there's disagreement at the intellectual level, there can often be vast agreement on the emotional level. And that's where you tap into people. Leaders and people that are just good at social influence are sensitive to and adept at influencing other people's emotional frame of reference. So they understand kind of at a crowd level, at a group level, what the emotional frame of reference is, and they're able to change that frame. And we'll talk about some techniques. How do you do that? One really potent tactic to change the emotional frame of reference is empathy. So people often come at us and they're angry, and they expect us, their emotional frame of the situation is hostility, aggression, conflict, anger, and they come at us with that anger. And we can do this kind of emotional judo where we listen to them and we have empathy, and by saying, oh, whoa, man, that sounds so hard, of course you're upset. We pivot the emotional frame of reference from one of conflict to one of sharing, understanding, whatever it is. And so that's why empathy can be a really powerful tool. If someone's coming at you with anger, with stress, with anxiety, just to listen to them and hear that will change the emotional content, emotional frame of reference of the interaction. Let me give you an example of this. This is kind of a superficial example, but I think it shows well what I mean by this. When I was in college, I was out late one night. Perhaps there had been some drinking involved. And it was like me and 3 or 4 of my friends were walking down the street at like 2 a.m. And this truck drives by us. It's got this huge lift on it and huge mud tires and rims, and it was even like spinners. Like back then, spinners were cool. Super like exhaust, and it goes peeling out by us. And my friend's like, "F you guys," and like screaming at him. And immediately the truck just slams on its brakes, and these 4 dudes hop out, and they're huge, and they're like, I don't know, maybe like 30 feet away from us, and they're walking towards us very menacingly. And my friends just kind of sit there like kind of slack-jawed. And in a moment of drunken brilliance, I was like, hey, hold on, guys, I got this. And I start walking towards the other guys, and I'm like, hey. And I finally get close, and I'm like, hey, man, your truck is so cool, dude. And like, can you show me all the modifications, man? I want something just like this. And like, it changes from this one of hostility, this emotional tone of hostility, to one of like, shared love or collaboration or admiration, right? And it like totally threw him off guard, right? He was walking, the other guy was walking into this expecting a conflict, and we didn't see one. It was just this dramatic shift in the emotional frame of reference. And okay, so that's what good leaders do, is they don't force you to act a certain way. They don't say, do X, Y, Z. What they can do, what they're adept at doing, is creating a perspective in you, a relationship to the situation in you, where doing X, Y, Z seems like the only logical or reasonable thing to do. So they don't tell you what to do. They create a frame of reference where what they want you to do is the only sensible direction of action. And that's what I mean by controlling the emotional frame of reference. And that's why it can be so influential and so powerful. I think when the word charisma to me describes people who are adept at this quality, where they're charismatic people aren't, we usually think of them as charming, and they are often, but it's more about there's something compelling about them. There's something engaging about them where you want their attention, right? And the way I think they do this is by they're able to excite whatever emotion they want in us, right? Whether that's inspiration or anger, or whatever it is. And they're able to play with our emotions in such an influential and powerful way that they just become these compelling people to us. I don't know if you know who Tony Robbins is. Tony Robbins is a guy who I think is good at this. And like, he has this one talent where he's really good at influencing the emotions in a room, and there's like no substance to him, but he does inspirational speaking with like 30,000 people in an arena, and he's like able to influence them emotionally. And there's no substance. He has like a philosophy, but it's just like completely cliche, right? But he's able to inspire people and or influence people in this way. And I think he's made a whole career out of it. When we meet people who are really good at this, who are really good at capturing and holding our interest and kind of being able to play our emotions like a fiddle, it almost feels like magic, right? There's something magic about it where it's almost like they have this like superpower or something. But it's not. It's not magic. It's not a superpower. It's not some waves they're sending through the air or pheromones. It's behaviors. It's things that they are doing. Often stuff it's like mirroring, where they're doing a good job of either reflecting your emotions back to you. They build up this kind of mirroring rapport and then start being able to guide the emotions, empathic responses to what people are feeling. But regardless, it's not magic. It's all these different tactics. And the next time you meet someone who you have this feeling about, this person that you consider really charismatic or really charming, pay attention to them in a concrete way. And what is it exactly that they're doing that makes them so likable or so compelling? And I guarantee you that it is a behavior. It is something about them or something that they're doing that creates this emotion ability. So pay attention to how other people do it, and then you can learn to mimic that and try out these different tactics and see what works for you as well. But it is 100% something that can be learned and improved upon. We've talked so far about coordinating moods. Next, we're going to talk about how we can take the framework from self-regulation of recognize, relax, distract, problem solve, and apply that to social regulation. All right, so you should be familiar with this graph by now. We have physiological arousal on the axis on the left, and we have time across the bottom. So basically what this is showing is that when there's some sort of emotional event, we have a physiological reaction to that. We feel that emotion in our body in some way, our heart rate, our breathing, our hand sweating. That's what that line is. So if we want to bring that down, if we want to help other people bring that down, first we need to recognize that they're having a powerful emotional experience. We need to help them relax through the first intense 2 or 3 minutes. We need to distract them so they don't ruminate. And then we can help them problem solve when they get close to baseline. So just like we do with ourselves when we have powerful emotional experience, recognize, relax, distract, problem solve, that is the exact same process we can use to help other people deal with powerful emotional experiences. We'll start off talking about recognize. First, you need to recognize that the other person is having a powerful emotional experience, and you recognize that so that you can initiate the following steps, right? So how do you know if someone's having a powerful emotional experience? Well, hey, we've been practicing listening a ton. That is a good way to know if someone's having emotions, is listen to them. They'll tell you about them. We've also been practicing observing nonverbals a lot. So both in all the listening activities in class, when you're the listener, when you're the observer, you get to pay attention to people's nonverbal behavior and how they communicate their emotions nonverbally. So we've had a lot of practice at paying attention to people's emotions. We talked about display rules, how we have to be careful about interpreting people's emotions, especially in work settings, because we often minimize our actual emotions, we exaggerate our actual emotions, or we substitute an inappropriate emotion for a more appropriate emotion. And of course, we learned all about our biases so that we don't, we protect ourselves against having skewed visions of people. And instead, we try to see people as multidimensional, as dynamic, and we see what's good and what's bad about them. Okay, so we've recognized that the person is having a powerful emotional experience. The next thing we want to do is help them relax. In order to help other people relax, the most important thing, the necessary but not sufficient condition, is that you stay calm. If you want other people to calm down, you have to demonstrate that calmness. You have to model that calmness. A really good example of this, dogs are so sensitive to our moods. Dogs really pick up on people's emotions very easily. And a friend of mine was walking her dog one day, and it ends up biting another dog. And her dog was a pit bull, and once they bite down, they don't like to let go. They tend to cling on. And so the other dog's owner was like freaking out and yelling and screaming. The other dog was, of course, freaking out. And my friend was like, listen, I understand why you're so upset, and you can yell at me as much as you want as soon as the dog quits biting. But if you don't calm down, if we all don't calm down and relax, then my dog will never let go. And they had to relax and they had to be calm and they had to pretend like everything was okay. And when they did that, then the dog let go and then the lady could freak out at her, right? It is the exact same thing with people, that you will never calm people down by becoming agitated. That if you want to help other people relax, the necessary condition for that is that you yourself are calm and relaxed. Another really powerful thing that can help people relax is just empathizing with them. Our emotions are kind of like a little kid in our head that's throwing a tantrum, and he's like, I'm gonna break stuff until you notice me. And that's kind of what emotions are. Like we go around doing bad things and bad behavior because we have this really powerful emotion that we want other people to see, we want them to recognize. And so by just giving that recognition to whatever the emotion is, that can usually take the steam out of it. Sometimes we can't bring ourselves to empathize with the other person, right? That we are so fundamentally in disagreement about their emotional experience that we don't want to have compassion or empathy for them. For example, like when people are really mad at us and we think that they're being unfair or unjust, sometimes it's hard to have empathy for that angry person. So if you can't empathize, and sometimes you can't, it can also be useful to acknowledge it and just say, okay, I understand that you're really angry with me. And then move on. But that recognition can sometimes help. Not as much as empathy, but still a little bit. If possible, take responsibility for your part in the situation. This doesn't mean admitting you're wrong. It doesn't mean admitting the other person's right. So for example, maybe someone's really upset because they made an incorrect assumption about you, and you're really upset that they made that assumption about you. But still, you can say, oh, I'm sorry I gave you that impression. I'm sorry I did things to make you see things from that perspective. Because you are, right? Like you didn't mean to give them a misinterpretation or a misimpression of you. And just say, hey, I'm sorry for that. That doesn't mean that they're right, that you're wrong. It's just taking responsibility for your part in the situation, and that usually helps calm them down. And then you can have a meaningful discussion. You can have a meaningful discussion about whatever the content of the disagreement is. This doesn't mean that you should let other people walk all over you, or that when other people challenge you, you should just immediately apologize and say you're wrong. I'm talking about when people are having this incredibly intense emotional reaction. You can take responsibility in your part with it, help calm them down, and then you can use the other skills that we've learned in this class, like listening, feedback. We're going to talk about persuasion. You can start using those skills on the person once they're in a more calm place. I don't mean just roll over all the time. Another powerful thing to help people relax is to compliment them. And especially we usually get self-conscious when we're being very emotional. And so one thing that can really kind of cheer people up in that instance is to be like, oh man, you're handling this so well. Like if that had happened to me, I would even be way angrier, or I would be way more stressed out. Like you're handling this very well. That's really, that helps people kind of feel better about the fact they're being emotional. And then that will help calm them down a little bit as well. No matter what tactic you use to try to relax people, and this is true of everything we're talking about in this lecture and in this class, you have to pay attention to the other person's response. So if you try a tactic and it makes them more angry, or it seems to upset them more, don't get upset with them. Don't resist that urge to get agitated yourself or to escalate yourself, and instead try a different tactic, pivot to a different tactic. And sometimes you have to go through a couple of tactics till you find something that works, and you just need to be patient and you need to be calm. We have recognized that the other person is having a powerful emotional reaction. We've helped them relax through the first incredibly intense 2 or 3 minutes of it. The next thing we're going to do is help distract them, because just like we like to ruminate, other people like to ruminate as well. So again, just like we like to ruminate, other people like to ruminate as well, and oftentimes they'll just, think about the same thing over and over, and they can even recruit us to be like enablers in that, right? And we feel compelled to because they're really upset about something. We're like, well, they want to vent, they need someone to talk to, and you end up having the same conversation with them like 3 times in a row, and you're just like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Don't do that. That's not being a good friend. That's enabling them to ruminate, that instead try to pivot them away, try to pivot them into a different conversation. I mean, certainly listen the first time, absolutely. But when you feel like it's gone beyond being helpful and productive and is just them ruminating, then get them away from that rumination. How do you do that? Well, we talked about social awareness last week, and so we're thoughtful, we're sensitive to how the people around us are emotionally influenced by places and situations and other people. So if we want to distract people, we know the things that they really enjoy, the things that they're really interested in, the people they like talking to. We've paid attention to the things that they like, and then when they're very emotional, we can introduce them to those things or bring them to those things to distract them from that emotion, to keep them from ruminating. What's really interesting is that in some ways we can know other people much more deeply than we can ever know ourselves. Other people see us with a much more objective eye, whereas we're always seeing ourselves from the inside, right? Let me give you an example of this. My girlfriend and I will go out to brunch, right? And she's like, "Oh, you getting the eggs Benedict?" And I'm like, "Well, let me look at the menu. I'll make a decision." And we get there, and I look through the menu, and then I end up ordering the eggs Benedict. And she's like, "See, I told you." What's going on for me is that when I go to brunch, I have like an algorithm in my head, like a breakfast choosing algorithm, and I got to go through all the menus. There's like all these like variables that go into what meal I decide to order, and that algorithm always comes to the same answer, which is eggs Benedict. I always end up getting eggs Benedict. But for me, each time I'm choosing eggs Benedict, right? I'm going through the process of choosing it. So I got to go through this whole long algorithm thing in my mind. For my girlfriend, she's like, Tommy gets eggs Benedict when he goes out to brunch. That's her algorithm, right? And so if you ask me, what do I want for brunch? I'll say, I don't know. I'd have to think about it. If you ask my girlfriend what I want for brunch, she'll say eggs Benedict. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it, that she actually knows me better than I know myself. And the people closest to us in our lives know us and we know them in some ways, not in all ways, of course, but in some ways we know them better than they know themselves. And so when people are really upset, we can use that knowledge because when people are upset, we often forget how to make ourselves feel better, but we know the things in the lives of the people around us that make them feel better. All right, so just like with our own emotional self-regulation, to help regulate and effectively deal with the emotions of other people, we need to recognize they're having this experience. We need to help them relax. We need to distract them from ruminating. And then finally, we need to help them problem solve. So they're having this emotional reaction for some reason. How can we help address that issue? Remember that problem solving is not the same thing as giving advice. And sometimes people, when they're having, a big problem, they'll come to us and really they want to vent, but they'll frame it as if they're asking us for advice. And then we're really tempted to give them our advice because that's what we want to do anyway. I would encourage you not to do that. When you give people advice, you're really saying, your problem's not that bad. Here's a solution. The other thing is if they do take your advice, they're probably going to be not satisfied with it, just in general. And then they're upset at you now, and you have to you're upset at them because they're upset at you, and it becomes this whole thing. So I would say when someone comes to you and they're very emotional and you're helping them problem solve, your role is not to solve the problem for them. Your role is to help them see the situation from a more objective perspective. And so it's really just asking questions like, well, what do you think you should do? If you did that, what do you think the good outcomes would be? What do you think the bad outcomes would be? And just asking them a lot of questions to help see the perspective or see the problem from a different perspective. And that's probably the most valuable thing that you can do for them, not offering them advice on how they should solve their problems. Okay, we've recognized that the person's having a powerful emotional reaction. We've helped them relax through the most intense part. We distract them from their rumination, and then we help them problem solve by helping them to see the situation from a different perspective. Remember, this isn't a one-time thing, that this is just like with us, how it's a cycle. With other people, it'll be a cycle as well. And we need to pay attention to where people are on this cycle in relation to the problem so that we know the right tactics to use that are most appropriate for kind of where they're at. Today we're talking about social regulation, and we've discussed the importance of coordinating moods, about using recognize, relax, distract, problem solve to help other people coordinate to deal healthily with their emotions. Next, we're going to talk about the importance of establishing boundaries. Boundaries establish which topics and behaviors are appropriate, and they are vital for healthy relationships of any type. I know it's easy listening to these lectures to think that I'm advocating that you should just be like besties with everyone you work with, and you guys should like have sleepovers and hold hands and like stare longingly into each other's eyes over lunch or whatever it is. And I am absolutely not recommending that. All of these techniques I'm talking about the emotions that come up in a workplace, in a work setting. I mean, obviously they're applicable in other settings as well, and I hope you use them for that. But when I'm talking about all this like emotional connection and listening to people, I'm talking about specifically with work-related content. Now, you might be working with someone, and maybe you're supervising someone, and he's having a really hard time at home for whatever reason, and he's been coming in late to work every day, and you talk to him about it, and he like breaks down, and he's like crying to you for an hour about all his problems, and you feel like kind of compelled to listen or to be there or whatever. You're not his therapist, right? You're not his best friend. And certainly give them, depending on your relationship with that person, give them time, listen to them. That's important. But ultimately what I'm talking about is you need to understand what's going on to the extent that it's going to impact their work, and what kind of accommodations do you both think is fair given that situation. That's the conversation you should be having with them. You don't have to be there and listen necessarily to all of their personal problems and empathize with all their personal problems and be their best friend. That's not your role, and that's not an appropriate role oftentimes. And so, listen to begin with, and then when appropriate, you can say, okay, I understand you're having a really hard time at home. Let's talk about how this is going to impact your work and what we can do to help you in regard to that, and pivot the conversation to something work-related. Likewise, if you have a coworker that like wants to go to lunch with you every single day and you don't want to do that, that's totally okay, right? You can just tell the coworker like, hey, I enjoy your company, but I like to have my lunches to myself. It's like a time for me to unwind or whatever it is. And that is a perfectly appropriate thing to say to a coworker. It's not rude. It's not inappropriate. You're setting boundaries about what type of behaviors are appropriate or not. Another example of this is we often we often very much dislike people who talk our ear off, right? And that's a lack of setting boundaries. That there's someone in your office that every time you see them, they talk to you for like 10 or 15 minutes, right? And you like start sneaking around corners to avoid them. That's because you're not setting up boundaries. That it is perfectly okay that 5 minutes into a conversation to be like, hey, I'm appreciating talking to you. I just really have to get some work done. Hope you have a good rest of your day. That's a perfectly okay thing to do. That's setting appropriate boundaries. Now, it would be rude if you don't give them any time, right? It's rude not to be willing to give someone 2-3 minutes to listen to their day, and you can decide what you think is appropriate on both ends of that. But it's not rude to come into work and need to get work done. And we think that people won't like this, right? Like we don't like putting up boundaries because we're worried people are going to be upset at us. That's not true. People don't dislike boundaries. People dislike mushy boundaries. People want you to tell them, hey, I enjoy talking to you this much. I'm no longer enjoying talking to you, right? Like we all hate the idea that we're boring someone, and other people hate that as well. And so we are reluctant to put up appropriate boundaries because we feel like we're going to alienate people. But in actuality, the opposite is true. People like knowing what our limits are, and we can be clear about that. Today we're talking about the importance of social regulation, and we've talked about coordinating moods, using recognize, relax, distract, problem solve to help other people deal with powerful emotional experiences. We've talked about the importance of establishing boundaries. And lastly, we'll talk about the importance of developing these social skills in other people. Every semester when I teach this, I have at least one student who's like, why do I always have to be the mature one? Like, why do I always have to be the patient one and the good listener? And like, why aren't people supposed to be patient with me and good listening with me? And why don't they regulate my emotions? That is a perfectly legitimate question. And the answer is you don't have to always be the more mature one. I usually do this because it's easier than the alternative. This is the least worst way to handle things, in my opinion. And it beats an alternative of going around and always getting in petty fights in your life. The other thing is I genuinely don't think that you should always be the one to do this, and that I don't think there can be a successful relationship where only one person does this type of social regulation, that both people in a relationship, or if you're on a team, all members of a team, need to be able to do it. It is too much of a burden for one person to bear. They cannot. And so especially if you're in a management position, if you're in a leadership position, I think it is one of the key responsibilities to help develop these skills in the people that you work with. Listening skills, feedback skills, persuasion skills, that you need to consciously develop these. And they're skills, right? Just like you teach someone how to use the copier or fax machine or whatever the kids are using these days, you can teach them these emotional skills, and they're very useful. And so I don't think it should always have to be you. I think everyone should have the luxury of occasionally being overwhelmed with emotion and know that the other people in their lives are going to be able to handle that in a healthy and mature way. We're talking about social regulation and relationship management today, and we talked about how you can coordinate moods through emotional contagion and through empathy and through shaping the emotional frame of reference. We talked about how you can help other people handle their powerful emotional experiences with the recognize, relax, distract, problem solve framework, just like we can use with our own emotions. We talked about the importance of establishing healthy boundaries and appropriate boundaries with people. And we talked about the importance of developing these social skills in others so it doesn't always fall on you to handle these powerful emotional situations. And again, I thoroughly apologize for how ugly this PowerPoint is. I'm embarrassed, guys. All right, have a good week.